の冷たい夏、音もなく流れ込む深紅の霧がたちまち世界を包み込み、ホーム異変と呼ばれる悲劇が訪れたのです。この異変は2人の人間の少女たちの活躍により幕を下ろします。この私とお遊戯しましょう。舞華蒼魔鏡始まり。異変解決、何が待っているのか楽しみね。
Azure Reflections, otherwise known as Maihana Somakyo, is, in my opinion, the most underrated shmup available on Switch. I've talked about it a couple of times in other videos, and I said I thought one of the big reasons for it not receiving as much attention as it perhaps deserves, and I stand by this, is that it just doesn't really look like it would be very good. The backgrounds are often just this kind of shapeless, low-definition murk. The bullet shapes and colours project an amateurish vibe and look confusing when mixed in with the pickup items. The popcorn enemies are mostly uninspiring, the characters juxtapose oddly with almost all the other visual elements, and the whole thing just looks kinda messy. If you've already played the game, you probably know that first impression isn't really wrong. The game is, certainly visually, kinda messy. But hey, sometimes that's okay, and in the case of Azure Reflections, I might even argue it lends the game a certain charm. It's a Touhou fan game, so I'll assume the characters will be familiar to many, and I won't bother commenting too much on them or their designs, as I'm sure you've already got your own opinion on them. Besides, what really matters most is always going to be gameplay, and in that department, Azure Reflections delivers in spades. There are just so many mechanics and options on offer here, and while such a wide spread all too often leads to individual mechanics feeling under-realised, in Azure Reflections everything comes together, both in-game and between stages, to create a really excellent overall package with plenty of scope for experimentation and naturally worked in pull factors that will keep you replaying for a long time indeed. If you've played Death Smiles, Azure Reflections' most basic mechanic ought to be pretty easy to grasp. While the screen does scroll as traditional horizontally to the right, your character can fire either left or right. This is accomplished by using two separate buttons instead of any directional input. There's also a focus movement button which slows your speed, focuses your fire and makes your hitbox visible. The character sprites are large, but your hitbox is necessarily tiny, and this feature is very handy indeed. The speed change is also more dramatic than in most shmups, and again you're going to need it big time when the patterns get dense, which believe me, they do. You also have a small number of special attacks which function much like bombs, and there's also a graze mechanic in operation when you get really up close and personal with enemy bullets. Grazing is slightly less risky than in many shmups, as Azure Reflections employs a stagger mechanic, meaning one hit knocks you back and renders you almost motionless for a brief moment, but if you can survive that second, you will be back on your feet and ready to keep shooting. Only if you get hit twice in succession will you actually lose a life. Power-ups are also dealt with in an unusual fashion. They're tiny and, annoyingly and confusingly, especially when you first start, can look an awful lot like enemy bullets. There's also just a hell of a lot of them, and you can either pick them up by flying over them, or interestingly, by moving to the side of the screen the enemy they came from entered, which will then see them sucked towards you. This of course carries a high risk, but it can be worth it when a sack full of bonuses are about to disappear off the field of play and you're too far away to reach them. I think any shmup fan would recognise that is a fair bit going on already, but there's still one move you have at your disposal we haven't mentioned, and it is far and away the most interesting of them all. Around your character there is a standard energy charge meter. When that fills you can begin a break attack. What this entails is pushing X to start the attack, at which point your character will spread her arms and become briefly invulnerable. Push in any direction and hit X again, and your character will dash in that direction. If you hit an enemy, you'll inflict a large amount of damage. As you dash, however, you will scoop up any bullets you move through and, The more you scoop up, the more powerful your dash attack will become when you finally ram into an enemy. After initializing the attack, you can make up to 3 dashes before the attack runs out, allowing you to, potentially, scoop up hundreds of enemy bullets and drive home that 3rd dash with punishingly huge force. Just be careful though, it can be easy to focus so much on scooping up the maximum number of bullets, you find yourself too distant from enemies after your 2nd dash, and end up unleashing all that hard work into thin air. Now this is a fun, original and engaging mechanic in the main stages, but where it really comes into its own, in fact where the whole game really comes into its own, is during the boss battles. The main stages, I'm afraid to say, are quite honestly rather weak, with repeating stage backgrounds and some poor visibility. They're mercifully brief, however, and basically they just serve as a bit of a break between the excellent boss battles. And that's fine, because the boss battles are really what this game is all about. Each boss has at least 4 clearly defined stages. They have a gauge around their sprite that you chip away at with your attacks, and when it reaches 0 they move on to their next stage. Within each stage, however, there are usually multiple different phases of attack patterns, and it really is incredible how the developers have managed to make so many of these patterns unusual, inventive, and on many occasions really quite beautiful, when there's such a vast quantity of them. Now of course the main aim here is to dodge the bullets and take out the boss, but the break dash attack adds an additional element of intrigue here. See, each boss is holding several spell cards, and to collect them you have to finish them off with a break dash. What makes this especially interesting is you can launch into what will hopefully be your final attack long before the boss's gauge is near 0, since the density of some of their attacks is going to allow you to scoop up huge hordes of bullets. Timing is everything, however, and much as there's nothing more satisfying than swooping right through the densest centre of a pattern just as it starts to expand, there's nothing worse than seeing a pattern start to dissipate outwards just as you arrive for the kill. Now, the game is not stingy when it comes to content, and despite there being so much variety within each boss battle, there are plenty of them to face, 11 I believe in total, including secret ones and an entire additional stage outside the main game. I mentioned the spell cards each boss can give up if defeated correctly, and you may be wondering what they are. Well, me too a little bit, because the story is all a bit of a mess. Although I will say, some of the dialogues do have the occasional funny line or two. Anyway, what the spell cards do is open up a bunch of unlocks, the main one being a character gallery with viewable figures of each playable character and boss. There are also multiple achievements, a music room, a library for those of you who do wish to delve into the story, and local and online score rankings. The most game-changing between-game option, however, is the accessories you can buy for each of your playable characters. These include masks, hairbands, eye patches, etc., and may seem a silly bit of cosmetic dress-up, but actually each accessory also offers its own unique buffs, and collecting and equipping enough of them ought to allow most players to eventually see the game through to the end, while still retaining a sense of satisfaction. Now, I feel like there's possibly still stuff that I haven't talked about, but honestly, whether it is bonuses, characters, story, or actual in-game mechanics, this game is just so bursting with content, it's difficult to keep track of everything it contains. That's one of the reasons I think it would be a good option for a physical release, but with nothing even rumoured on that front, I'd highly recommend going for the digital if you haven't already. Despite its visual shortcomings, Azure Reflections does more than enough where it counts, and the range of cleverly implemented mechanics, coupled with the wealth of content, means I'm happy to give it an 8.5 out of 10, and I really hope it doesn't stay in that underrated category, as it truly deserves a wider audience. Now, maybe I'm actually wrong in thinking it's not been that popular, and everybody's been playing it for years, so please do let me know your thoughts, whether you've already picked it up or are planning to later, or even if you've looked at it and thought, nah, not for me. It's always fascinating to read others' opinions, and I really appreciate all the comments. Thanks very much everyone for watching, hope to see you next time. Cheers.
ね。悪くなかったんじゃない？昨夜。ありがとうございます、レミリア様。物語るのは全てを知る者の務め。 愚かな客人たちにも見せてあげましょう。それではお茶会の準備を始めます。もちろん戦いの備えを。